So welcome back to the last little bit of video that we're going to cover on the Civil War. We were looking in particular at Lenin's role in the Civil War. And we were considering Maudsley's view of what Lenin did in the Civil War itself. And while he wasn't saying that Lenin was key in the military victory, Lenin did play an important role in just controlling the state and the party, which was essential, and also backing off to allow Trotsky to do things with the army, for example, that needed to be done in order to win the Civil War. So let's take then a look at the role of Trotsky in the Civil War. And again, I've got a quote here from Evan Maudsley. So Maudsley notes that too often in historiography out there, Trotsky is either, by the Soviet historians, removed of any significant role in the Civil War. This is because later on Trotsky and Stalin have a big falling out, and Trotsky becomes very much the enemy of the state. And so history written in the Soviet Union after that point in time makes Trotsky out to be the real bad guy, the real enemy. So any significance that he did have in the Civil War has been removed. By Western historians, however, we often see that Trotsky's role is exaggerated, that they give him a higher level of importance than maybe he actually deserves. Maudsley notes that Trotsky did have his failures, including, it was his foreign policy at Brest-Litovsk in 1918 that led to very close, almost lost Petrograd to the Germans. Also, 1919, while we think of Trotsky as this massive military hero, the Reds almost lost the war in 1919. And part of that is because of Trotsky's military failures. Also, Trotsky tried to influence economic policy in 1920, and that was opposed by Lenin. So Trotsky wasn't always winning and doing well at all times during the Civil War. Maudsley notes, however, that Trotsky's vital step was to support the creation of a regular army against much party opposition. You might recall that when the Bolsheviks first get in, they want to get rid of the Red Army. They want to get rid of the army, they want to get rid of officers and ranks and salutes and that kind of thing. When Trotsky realized the need to bring it back in 1918 to establish the Red Army with all of that discipline and salutes and ranks again, there were a lot of people in the Bolsheviks that were very upset about that move and really opposed it. Trotsky pushed for it, though. He got Lenin's support for it, and that is absolutely key to winning the Civil War. It says here, Maudsley goes on, Trotsky also played an important agitational role. His famous headquarters train covered 65,000 miles, and all this was something, this agitational stuff, that was something Lenin could not have done, in Maudsley's opinion. The fighting men of the Civil War needed a figurehead to rally around, and Trotsky played his part effectively. So Trotsky, not necessarily as a general, but as a military figurehead, what he did with his train was he went from place to place, whipping up the Red Army, reinforcing what it is that they were fighting for. They were fighting for Russia, fighting for the revolution. And moving into later 1919 and into 1920, that role, what Trotsky did was really, really effective. And this was a major contribution to the Reds ultimately winning the Civil War. So having had a look at some of the different roles that were played, let's take an overall look at the consequences of civil war and war communism. So overall, we're talking about a massive loss of life. Now, again, every history book you look at, it's going to have different figures. So I've tried to pull together some fairly high estimates without being on the ridiculously high side that we see from some of the historians. So if we look at this, we've got 300,000 who died in action, those who actually, died in battles. 50,000 soldiers died from wounds they received in battles. This figure, though, is astounding. 450,000 soldiers died from disease. I talked about the conditions that they were existing under And this is a real telltale sign. 450,000 from disease alone. That's more than died in action. We also see around 350,000 civilians dead as a result of the Red and the White Terror. 1.9 million people then died from disease in 1919 and 20. So this is on top of the soldiers. This is 1.9 million civilians. These are the conditions that war communism and the Civil War generally brought to Russia with this tight grain requisitioning. Also, we see 2 million emigres, migrants, leaving Russia. Now, most of those, of course, would have been upper class, upper middle class, educated, wealthy. These 2 million people leave Russia and never come back. They settle elsewhere. I've talked about some of the places that they went, like Paris and London, all the way to America, setting up new Russian emigre communities. Also, as a result of the Civil War, we have 7 million homeless children. Children separated from their families, left with no parents, left with nowhere to live. Have a think about what it's going to cost the state now to try to control this. Also, a further 5 million people died in the 1921 famine. I showed you some pictures and talked about that earlier. It particularly hit the Ukraine, but we see it more broad spread across Russia as well. This is the impact of civil war, the actual fighting, as well as the policies of war communism. This is what they cause. We've got to look beyond the mere loss of numbers, though. As historians, we've got to have a broader concept of what the consequences were. So the next dot point says that because they won the Civil War, the Bolsheviks have now been given an opportunity to consolidate their power in Russia and establish a new state. And what they do is establish the first long-term communist state in the world. And the winning the Civil War, getting rid of their external enemies, including the Allies who decide it's too difficult and sort of go away for a while, the Reds, the Bolsheviks now have breathing space. They have a chance to actually bring Russia under control. The revolution that started on the 25th of October, they are finally getting towards actually being in control of the country. Also, a bad side effect of the Civil War and war communism is that agricultural and industrial output has been greatly diminished. So if we tie it in with the next point, that our urban working class is greatly diminished, many of them died in the Civil War. Some of them off fighting in order to save their revolution. But when you have a diminished urban working class, you have less labour to work in your industrial factories. Also, as we've talked about, agriculture suffered because the grain requisitioning had been so harsh, extracting the grain seeds from the peasants, not enough was being planted. And then when we think about the dislocation of the peasants, moved from their land, there's a lot of problems now. And if you have a look in your booklets, you'll be able to see the huge reduction in agricultural and industrial output. If you have a look at the figures from before 1914, have a look at the figures in 1920, 1921, greatly diminished. First of all, as we know, affected by World War I, now greatly affected by the Civil War and war communism. On the other side, however, we have to acknowledge now that the area that's under communist control is much, much larger. Remember our black blobby map that we see happening in October, November 1917, where they've only got control of very small territorial areas. They now have control of 80% of what used to be the old Tsarist Empire. Much of the land that they lost under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk has been regained, as well as other areas that seem to be breaking off. What that means is they've now got better access to agriculture and industry again as a result of these territorial gains made during the Civil War. This was an opportunity for the Bolsheviks to actually expand their power, and they've done it successfully. Also, we've really got to think about the systems that were established by the Bolsheviks during this period of time when their government is under siege. What they have done is established a very centralized system of power, and they are achieving a lot of their outcomes through coercion over the population and very arbitrary, that is, it's not consistent application of government power. That becomes the norm. What we see established in the Civil War and war communism, we see continue through the 1920s and into the Stalinist era of the 1930s. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Stalinist era. Did Stalin create the totalitarian system, or do we see the beginnings of it here while Lenin and Trotsky are in charge during the Civil War period? So there are a lot of consequences to think about from the Civil War and war communism. Some, of course, hugely negative. Others, however, put the Bolsheviks in a very strong position now to be able to move forward with their consolidation of power. And when you think about the significance of the Civil War in this period, you have to think about all of these different points, all of these different things in making your assessment about whether the Civil War and war communism was significant in enabling the Bolsheviks to go ahead and ultimately consolidate their power. So that's it for this video on the Civil War. What I'd really like you to do now is continue reading, pulling ideas out. Remember, don't get too fixated on exactly what happens on a day-to-day basis within the Civil War. I really want you to think about why it happened and also the impact of it and certainly the consequences once it's over. And think about both the Civil War and that policy of war communism as well. That's it for now.